Welcome to those of you who are joining us on Zoom. You'll just give us a moment for everyone to load into the Zoom room. We will get started momentarily. Good morning. We're delighted today to welcome Frank Lavin to discuss his book, The Smart Business Guide to China E-commerce. We'll be posting a link in the chat so you can purchase the book if you wish. We hope you do. Before I turn over the stage to my dear friend Andrew Gelfuso to introduce today's discussants, I'd like to say a couple quick words about upcoming WITA webinars. On Thursday, November 18th, we'll be holding an event to preview the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference. That event will feature Alan Wolf, the former Deputy Director General of the WTO, among others. Then on Thursday, December 9th, we'll have a very special multi-part event looking back at the 20th anniversary of China joining the WTO. We'll be co-hosting that event with the Asia Society Policy Institute. And mark your calendars for the 2022 Washington International Trade Conference on January 31st and February 1st. That event will be fully online, but also have a keynote luncheon hosted at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, DC. If you've been on past WITA webinars, you know we like to call out the names of some of those you are in community with, even if you can't see them on Zoom. So welcome today to Lisa Chen with Arcadia International Business Corp, Jessica Holton with British Airways, Kevin Carney with Digital Crew, and Jennifer Pang with Viacom CBS Consumer Products. Welcome Lisa, Jessica, Kevin, Jennifer, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of Frank using the Q&A tab on Zoom. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I'd like to now introduce my good friend and WITA event partner, Andrew Gelfuso, Vice President, Trade Center Management Associates, the management firm that runs the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center. WITA hosts most of its in-person events at the Ronald Reagan Building, and we're delighted to welcome Andrew today to introduce our guests. Andrew?
Thanks so much, Ken. We're so pleased to be a WITA partner, and not just for today's webinar, but for the continued relationship we have in place. Good morning, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here along with all the online viewers and esteemed guests. I'm really looking forward to today's program. We know e-commerce seems to be a dominant way of doing business, and starting an online business seems like an attractive idea for many savvy entrepreneurs. But before anyone dives into this dynamic business sector, they first need to learn the ropes of the e-commerce industry and have a strong, specific market entry tools. So like many of you, I'm looking forward to hearing from Frank Lavin today to discuss his newest book, The Smart Business Guide to China E-commerce. Frank's been a great friend over the years, and I'm very much looking forward to the program and learning the latest trends on one of the world's largest e-commerce markets. Frank Lavin has 30 years of experience helping companies succeed in China through leadership roles in banking, marketing, and diplomacy. In government, Frank served as ambassador to Singapore and undersecretary of commerce for international trade. In the latter role, he was lead trade negotiator for both China and India and was the senior policy official responsible for commercial policy, export promotion, and trade negotiations. In the private sector, Frank was most recently an Asia practice group leader at Edelman, and prior to that, he worked in senior finance and management positions in Hong Kong and Singapore with Bank of America and Citibank. Frank also served as the chairman of the steering committee of the USA Pavilion at the Shanghai 2010 World Expo. And Frank is the co-author of Export Now, and most recently, The Smart Business Guide to China E-commerce. And Frank, we enjoyed working with you on your launch event for Export Now. And now with that, it's a great pleasure to introduce Maxwell Kahn, who will serve as our moderator for today's program. Max is the president of Coresight Research and hails from the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia Business School. He began his career at McKinsey, and then he further developed his expertise in the consumer at Johnson & Johnson and Merck in both operating and venture investing roles. Before Coresight, Max spent 5 years between two roles for Wiser Together as a board member and ultimately CEO. Max understands the importance of delivering a great retail experience supported by strong technology. This expertise has exemplified his career in banking, consulting, and investing. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to turn it over to you, Max.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. I appreciate the introduction, and welcome everyone. Welcome Frank in particular. Just a real quick housekeeping item. We're gonna Frank and I will chat for about 20-ish minutes, but we definitely have time for Q&A. And to the degree that people want to ask questions, please feel free to do so during the questions that make flow the and if not, we will also take some questions at the end as well. So please do feel free to put in questions whenever you want. Coresight is a global research firm covering the retail and the consumer, and we have a office in both Shanghai as well as in Hong Kong. China is a very important part of our practice because of all the innovations that come from China, as well as the opportunities that exist for retailers in the Chinese market. So we've gotten to know Frank as a firm, and I have personally, because we have actually done some work together, particularly around, and this is why this is such a great week for us to be having this conversation, is because we've in particular gotten to know Frank around the Singles Day 11/11 shopping festival that Alibaba does every year. And in fact, the last time that Frank and I worked together was in person in Hangzhou in 2019, right before, not long before everything kind of shut down, both in China and then, of course, in the rest of the world. So it's a perfect time for us to be talking about this. We will be with Frank actually this week in New York, because we're still not traveling to China, for the most part, but Alibaba is actually having an event here in New York. So we're looking forward to seeing him there as well. So with that being said, why don't we just jump in? And, Frank, you and I talked yesterday in preparation for this. And, one of the things that we really kind of emphasized was, why China, right? There's lots of places that you can go in the world. China in some ways is complicated, it's unknown, but it's still, right, is one of the more attractive places for a company to be thinking about doing investment. And so we'd love to hear, why don't we kick off with, why is China so attractive?
That's a great question. May I just observe a moment of protocol here, though? And Max, thank you for your service here today. It's great to be back together with you. And I do remember we were running around Hangzhou and Shanghai. Now it seems 2 or 3 years ago, pre-COVID. But it'll be good to be back together with you tomorrow in New York. Look forward to that. And thanks to Ken for hosting this. WITA's done such a great job in keeping the international trade issues alive during the pandemic. Andrew, thank you for that very gracious introduction. It's good to reconnect with you as well, my friend. And I remember you graciously hosted the launch of the previous book. So it seems every time there's a new book, we'll get together again. So on that basis, good to get together. And Max, you put your finger on it. Why? Look, half of this discussion we might have needed to have 10 years ago, which is the utility of e-commerce or the applicability of e-commerce or the desire for an e-commerce strategy. I'd say almost without exception, that battle's over. The entire world of consumer brands over the last decade has moved to e-commerce and are fervent champions of e-commerce. Indeed, for almost any brand you'll encounter, they will say our e-commerce sales are outpacing our traditional segment sales. And indeed, when you guys at Coresight, you look at the global statistics, when we see them, we say in every single market in the world, e-commerce is gaining market share against traditional outlets. So that battle of, is e-commerce important? Do I need an e-commerce strategy? What kind of weight do I put on e-commerce? That battle is over. But what remains is, look, how do I apply that, if at all, to my international strategy? And why China, as you articulated? And I think it just comes down to, in the first instance, it comes down to just size, just the law of large numbers, which is to say, if you can make something good happen, then the larger the base on which you can make that happen, the better the results will be, and the happier you'll be with the outcome. And if just conceptually, it takes the same amount of work to put together an e-commerce strategy for Italy or Argentina or China, you've got to deal with international logistics. You've got to deal with labeling and testing. You've got to deal with foreign exchange issues. You've got to have strategy and implementation and IT integration. And so there's a little bit of work involved regardless of the market. Well, if you've got to do that same amount of work against any market you go into, there's a heck of a strong argument to start with the biggest markets. And China, not just, we know it's the biggest retail market in the world, bigger than the US as a retail market, smaller than the US in terms of overall GDP, but it is the biggest e-commerce market in the world by far. Alibaba is about 3 times the size of Amazon by sales, and over 50% of global e-commerce takes place in China. So if you're an e-commerce oriented company, e-commerce oriented brand, you'd say, boy, China is going to be the greatest potential market for you just on the basis of size. So that alone, I think, entices a lot of companies to say, I need to think about China. May I just make one other point on this, Max? There's one other very interesting point that we've come across, which is to say, because China, of all the major markets, China is the only market that is still a developing market. All the other major markets, large GDP markets, are fully mature, whether it's the European markets or Canada or Japan, Australia. These are fully mature. They've been prosperous for multi-generations. For most of those markets you go into, and American businesses can do very well in those markets, for most of those markets, you're going to be going face-to-face. You'll be going head-to-head competition with an incumbent brand in the premium space. In China, you typically will not, meaning there's not a legacy brand in China in the premium space. The Chinese brands do very well in the value segment of the market, in the mid-tier segment of the market, but they aren't entrenched in the premium segment the way they are in Europe or Japan. So you've got just more running room in a market like China than you might have in other markets.
Well, and I think, Frank, you also discussed in your book, picking up on the running room theme, right? In addition, not just in the sense that the markets are not fully developed from a competition standpoint, but also not fully developed, right, from a growth standpoint as well, right? So maybe it might be helpful to just spend a couple minutes around the idea that, high GDP growth rates relative to other, developed nations, right, is, still in kind of China's future based on the fact that they're not fully developed yet.
I think that's an excellent point, Max, that China continues to outperform world averages with growth rates. And that in itself conditions consumer behavior. So China, by the way, China is off peak or past peak. It's no longer hitting the 7% or 8% growth rates it had for an extended period of time, but it's still on that 5 to 6% growth rate. But the point is, what we see in developing markets is that consumer spending outpaces GDP growth rate, meaning if you've just gotten a factory job for the first time ever in your family, a disproportionate percentage of your earnings go into consumer goods. Or if you're the first college graduate in your family ever, a disproportionate percentage of your earnings go into consumer. No surprise to any of this, because for the first time in your family history, you're able to have a little bit of purchasing power, a little bit of disposable income, and you want to enjoy a better life. So we run into this all the time. In Shanghai, you'll find a junior person right out of college who's working for Ernst & Young, and he says, yeah, my dad was a factory worker. My dad worked on the farm, and my income as a 23-year-old, my income is over 10 times what my father's was at peak. So yeah, I can enjoy life a little bit. I can go to the movie theater, I can go to a restaurant, I can buy a bottle of wine, I can buy a pair of Nikes. And so that phenomenon of the emerging middle class and upper middle class in China is much more pronounced than you'll see in other markets around the world, where it's already a pretty mature and purchasing patterns are already pretty well established.
So tell us a little bit, you talk about that new sort of office worker, much higher income, buying things like Nikes, right? Tell us a little bit about that. What is that consumer like? What are their tastes? What are the kinds of things that they're looking to purchase?
Yeah, well, let me start with the general point about the strength of the brand. And what China reminds us is that a strong brand, almost by definition, has essentially the same value proposition in every market. It says it has the same message. So if you think of these great global companies like Mercedes or Estee Lauder or IKEA, these are fabulous products, and they resonate with consumers in every market in the world, and for the same set of reasons, right? So that holds true in China, but there's an important caveat to that point. You see in China an exposition of convergence theory. Convergence theory says that consumer tastes around the world tend to converge if you hold even for education and purchasing power. So that affluent person in Norway is just as likely to buy a Mercedes-Benz as the affluent person in Shanghai. and for the same set of reasons, because it's a great car, right? And it has maybe a high performance and high status as well. So it's a very attractive to the right person. But the big difference is this: because China is still just emerging into middle income status, the percentage of population that has that disposable income is considerably smaller. Average per capita income in China is considerably smaller. So back to Nike for a second. If we ask the Nike marketing people, this is just conjecture on my part. If we ask the Nike marketing people in the United States, what percentage of the American public are you speaking to? Who in America do you want to talk to? I think they'd say something like, well, 75% of the country, more or less, has purchasing power to buy a Nike pair of Nikes. We don't speak to the very young. We don't speak to the very old. We don't speak to the very poor. But we speak to most folks in America, and most people in America have some connectivity with Nike. If you ask the Nike people in China, well, who are you speaking to in China? The answer won't be 75%. It might be 25%. They say only about 25% of the country has the purchasing power to buy a pair of Nikes. So it's a very different communication strategy and marketing strategy. That in the US, it's a mass premium product. In China, it's deeper into the premium space, or maybe even ultra premium product given per capita purchasing power. But Max, the saving grace of all this, of course, is your population base is 4 times as large. So even if it's 25% of the population, well, that's 350 million people you're speaking with, and you're going to have quite a successful marketing campaign just with that segment of the population.
Right. And then it's 25% this year, 27% next year, right, is the other, factor as well, right?
Absolutely right. You're on the right side of that curve. As purchasing power grows, you're moving up. I think you asked a question about the consumer. I think what that consumer wants, and what I think the brands respect, is brand integrity. That pair of Nikes is identical in China as it is in the US. The Nike, I think quite wisely, doesn't say, well, we're going to make a down market pair of Nikes, we're going to make a value pair of Nikes, emerging market pair, China pair of Nikes, and we're going to try to go mass market. I'd say, don't do that. You're destroying your brand value. You're destroying what's special about this brand. So stay where you are. And as you point out, Max, the consumer is moving toward you. So,
right.
And the consumer respects the integrity. There's no down market Mercedes, right? You might buy the fully loaded one if you have more money. You might buy, something more accessible if you don't. But it's still a great Mercedes-Benz. It's the same product every country.
So, if you read the news, right, you might say, well, some of that sentiment, some of that halo effect on Nike globally maybe has been dimmed a little bit, recently across Western brands in China. But I would say that at Coresight, right, we would say that that's media hype and not actually the reality in the on the ground in China. Would love to hear, your perspective on that and what you're seeing in terms of, why people really shouldn't be, concerned about going into China just because of kind of the headlines.
Yeah, I'll say this. China does remain an enormously promising market. And I would say any serious brand ought to think through a China strategy. At the same time, to your point, boy, there's issues. There's issues from COVID. There's issues from economic uncertainty, and there's certainly political friction and political tension. Now, I'd say even with all of that, you still need to think through your international strategy. I've had several discussions. I'm sure you've had the same conversation, Max, with brands who were going through a UK strategy, going into Britain in the middle of Brexit. And Brexit injected a lot of uncertainty, a lot of cost, and really, made the brands a bit uncomfortable because it was hard to predict. Everybody wants sunny weather, and Brexit said it's not going to be sunny weather. But the bottom line was Britain is still Britain. The market's still the market, and everything that made Britain attractive to you as a market before Brexit, it's still intact after Brexit. There's probably a little more cost, a little more complexity. But I would just make that same point about China. It's still a fabulous market. And I'll say this, even in the middle, I think things have improved a little bit, tone's improved a little bit, underlying issues probably still the same. But even if we go back 2 or 3 years when the United States put tariffs on Chinese goods and China put some tariffs on US goods, it never became a public political issue. And I think quite wisely, I commend the Chinese leadership. They never made this a public issue in China, meaning there was no calls for boycott of American goods, no protest at American stores, no burning American items. And by the way, we've done that sometimes in the US. As you go back to the 1970s, people said, I'm going to smash a Toyota, or the odd kind of things to protest trade policy. So the population was very disciplined, and it didn't turn into discontent for American goods. And I think there's enormous respect at the consumer level for consumer goods, for American goods. And as you're suggesting, Max, I think this year we're going to see the best year in China forever for Nike, for Coca-Cola, for Kentucky Fried Chicken, for Procter & Gamble. I mean, it is a fabulous consumer market, and they like those same great products for the same reason we in America like those products, because they provide value to the consumer.
Yeah, and we are seeing also, I mean, and you talked about this a little bit, you know, when you were talking about Nike, and I'd love for you to expand on maybe this a little bit, but we see that, you know, when brands stay true to their global brand, right? Now they have to do some difference as they go into a new market, right? But the core of what their positioning, of their presence, right, links back to the global brand. That, you know, that there are a lot of brands that maybe don't have a big presence in China, but because of convergence, there's awareness of them in China, and that when companies come in, you know, kind of sticking to that, their sort of global brand, as opposed to trying to come up with a new branding strategy in China that tends to, you know, drive the most success and continues to be successful. So would love to, you know, hear your perspectives on that and your experiences on that as well.
I think that's a really good summary, Max. I'd say in the first instance, the fact that you're in the digital space just dramatically lowers the cost of market entry. Your ability to communicate and get on Chinese social media and tell your brand story and your value proposition and have third-party endorsement and key opinion leaders and show video, all of the ecosystem of Chinese social media is open-ended and reasonably inexpensive. So it rewards the digitally oriented companies. And same thing with e-commerce. And instead of taking, you know, $1 or $2 million to open up a physical store in Shanghai for $100,000 or less, you can open up a store on Tmall, and you can really have a footprint in that market. Now you're going to have to advertise and have social media on top of that. And I think you're also very right that you've got to have that brand integrity. You've got to have that formal brand position, but then you can localize some of the messaging and some of the attributes. I mean, the best example, I think we all know, we were just talking about Singles Day. The best example might be you've got to recognize local holidays and local traditions. And so build your promotional activity around that. There might be local flavorings or colorings. I'm sure if you talk to the Nike people, they'll say, yeah, we're selling the same shoes, but some of the color assortments are different because the Chinese consumer might have preferences for this color or that color. We did a lot of work for one of the US major wine associations, and it was very interesting to them that the mixture of red wine to white wine of consumer preference. The consumers is different in China and the US. But you'd say, I'd be surprised if it were the same. I mean, consumers all around the world are different, and everybody arrives at their own conclusion. And the great thing about the market is it allows the consumer to have his preference or her preference. So I'd say be mindful of that you could have the same array of SKUs out there, the same product slate, and all of a sudden something that was a secondary seller in your home market becomes a primary seller. And look, the elements of the brand value proposition, I think, can change. I was interesting to me, I was just looking at Budweiser ads in China and Budweiser ads in the United States. And it gets to a very fundamental question that I assume everybody on this webinar can answer. What is the point of beer? Why do you have a beer, and why do you invite someone else to have a beer with you? Well, we know in America, having a beer and inviting someone to have beer with you is a sign of friendship or sociability or respect or ongoing interaction. You've had a business meeting, let's get a beer. So it's a very common signifier of some kind of friendship or respect. That is certainly true in China, but there's something more in the Anheuser-Busch ads in China, that having a beer is an important way to celebrate success. That in a proper business environment, when the deal's closed and you won the contract or you pulled the rabbit out of the hat, you got the account, let's go have a beer to celebrate. And it's a triumph signifier, right? Not just friendship, right? So you'd say, boy, that's something that's not in the Budweiser ads in the US that is in the Budweiser ads in China. So it's still the exact same beer, it still is the same kind of meaning a lot of ways, but they just tweaked, I think, some of the messaging and some of the value proposition for the Chinese audience.
Yeah, and Frank, you've also talked a few times about, e-commerce, the size of the e-commerce market in China, the leveraging e-commerce in terms of your strategy coming into China as well. I think one of the things we haven't touched upon, though, is just the sophistication of the platforms that sort of make that easier for a Western brand to come into China. Maybe if you could just expand a little bit about, just like why then, can a company coming in, entering the Chinese market, kind of leverage the e-commerce strategy? What's in place in China that kind of enables that for Western?
So that's a great point, Max. You could argue that China has the most sophisticated or most advanced e-commerce ecosystem in the world. And there are some elements of Chinese e-commerce that have now been adopted in the US, like same-day delivery or augmented reality and so forth. But if we just look at Tmall, for example, Tmall is the largest B2C platform. It's part of the Alibaba group. It probably has 60 or 70% of the B2C market in China. So we end up running a lot of stores on Tmall for clients. They will, for example, different than Amazon, they will let you run your own store, your own storefront, your own graphics, your own look, your own design. So back to Nike, the Nike Tmall store, nike.tmall.com, looks exactly the same as Nike.com in the US, right? It's a Nike store, but you visit it through the Tmall platform. So that gives brands enormous flexibility in how they identify themselves and portray themselves and communicate. And that consistency of images and brand messaging is very, very powerful in China. China also has an extraordinary social media ecosystem where, as we say, 900 million smartphones in China. This means 900 million Chinese have a shopping mall in their pocket, right? And they use their smartphone for not just shopping, but they use it for product discovery. They use it for all of their social media, for connecting with friends. They use it for news and entertainment. They use it for gamification. They use it for payment services, for ride hailing, for ordering food in restaurants. But you could, it's a sort of universal tool now that is much more widely adopted in the US than in China, I should say, than in the US, but it gives a whole life to e-commerce. So that core point, not only does most e-commerce in the world take place in China, but if we look at retail sales in the US, about 20% of retail sales in the US take place online. If we look at retail sales in China, over 50% of retail sales in China take place online. So I said the battle's over. E-commerce has won, and you can have a heck of a footprint, a heck of a connectivity with a pure play e-commerce strategy. So we'd say in China, every brand can be a pure play e-commerce brand and do extremely well in that market.
Great. I just want to remind everyone that, we're going to, Frank and I are going to talk about a couple more things here, but do want to remind everyone that we will, we're happy to answer questions if anyone has questions. But Frank, one of the things that you and I still remember talking about this when we were together in Hangzhou 2 years ago. Some of the critical, sort of strategic, high level critical success factors for folks entering China. And you and I talked about this a bit yesterday as well, around, having international experience versus not having as much international experience, and how that can impact, sort of the approach that a brand maybe, or a company may be thinking about taking when they're entering the China market.
Yeah, and look, we've seen both segments. There's some companies that say, look, we're in 8 or 10 markets already, and now we're going to go to China. There's some companies that say, look, we've really never done anything outside the US, but I really loved Max and Frank's discussion. China is this huge market, and we're just going to go to China. We'd say both. We've seen both of those work. My only comment is, if you're in the former group and you've already said, I've been in France for 20 years, I've been in Germany for 15 years, I've been in Mexico for 10 years. If you've already got a reasonable sophistication internally about international behavior and how to adapt the messaging for local markets and international shipping and foreign exchange, you've already kind of worked through that. And it's going to be a little bit easier just to hook China into that mix. If you've never done it at all, I would just say that, remember, you're taking two journeys simultaneously. You're taking the international journey for your company or your logistics team and your CFO and your compliance guys. All of them have to get comfortable with international behavior in general, and then you're taking a China-specific journey. So it's a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit longer, but boy, we've seen it. And the saving element here, Max, is the digital side. Some companies find that they're a mid-sized US brand, few $100 million in sales. They've never really done anything outside the US at all formally, but we can look up online and we can say, you've got $2 million in annual sales in gray market in China. So the Chinese consumer is ahead of you. Chinese consumer already knows the brand, knows the product, is already discussing it. There's already some sentiment about the brand that exists in the market. So you're somewhat pushing on an open door, right? You don't have to do all the expensive brand building. So we would always look at market sentiment. Is your product currently discussed in social media? Does it have any traction at all with the Chinese consumers? Or are you completely new to market where it's going to be just a longer journey if you're in that category?
Yeah. So one of the things you also talk about in the book is that concept of, the JCurve, which I think is very interesting in terms of thinking about the investment relative to when, you can really see profits, distributing to, so to your point about, sort of how much effort, how much work that may or may not take, I'd love, if you don't mind talking a little bit about that in general, and then how that might differ.
That's a great point, Max. Look, let's say this. Most companies we work with, whether it's American or European, most companies we work with through their entire history have largely or maybe exclusively grown organically. They might be 30 years old, they might be 130 years old, but what they'll say is, look, we grow 5 or 10% a year and we've been doing this for 50 years. And all that means is every year we make 10% more, we sell 10% more, we have 10% more profits. That's great. And if you look at US consumer goods, what that person really wants to hear is he wants to get a phone call from somebody who owns the largest chain of department stores in Minnesota and says, I need to buy $10,000 a month of your product. And I say, great, I ship it out, I do a purchase order, I ship it out, and I bill you $10,000 a month, and it's just all incremental income. That's organic growth, that's fantastic. China or any new market is not organic growth, it's strategic growth. Nobody's heard of you necessarily in China. Nobody's met you before in China. Nobody fully understands your value proposition in China. So you've got to go through this education and communication and outreach activity that you just don't have to do in your home market. So the point is you're going to have to over invest in communication and social media and live streaming, all of these attributes, but you're going to have to over invest to build that brand. So our view is, look, for that first year or two, it's not realistic to expect a profit. And indeed, if you're hitting a profit, you might be doing it wrong. You might be not growing rapidly enough. You might want to say, look, we should be aiming for $10 million. We should be investing for $10 million in sales. That means a bit of a J curve, meaning our profit position goes down first for a year or two, then it comes back up, and then we're just chasing sales growth. So just recognize that whenever you go into a new market, you're going to face that kind of J curve of strategic growth, not the linear pattern of organic growth.
So we have a question just going back a little bit to experience, with international. This is, someone obviously that has dealt with, international issues probably in other markets. But the question is about customs, right? What are the custom related issues, particularly for e-commerce in China?
I'll tell you, we only work in the consumer goods space. Beauty and makeup products, apparel products, food, processed food, not fresh food, but we do processed food, and household goods, pet supplies, and so forth. So we work on that space. I will tell you, China does a very good job of regularized, transparent customs treatment for those goods. Everything is declared, everything is sold online. There's no scope for monkey business. We're not bringing material in and it disappears, right? But it goes right to our warehouse. It goes right to online sales. All of the sales data goes to the tax authorities. They know what tax they collect, we collect. So there's just not scope for fraudulent behavior. And in my personal experience, we've worked with several hundred brands in China. I would say if this product is approved and legally sold in the United States, there's well over a 99% likelihood that it can be legally sold in China. Every once in a while, not even once a year, but you might run into a chemical preservative or some other product, that additive that is not yet approved in China. And so the product has to be reformulated for the China market. So it does occasionally happen, but it's quite rare that because their Food and Drug Administration is not radically different than ours. And if, we did, for example, work with Smucker's jams and jellies, if this product's been around for 150 years in the United States, and let's face it, it's grape jelly, it's grapes and sugar and pectin, and that's it. There's no preservatives, no artificial coloring. Yeah, it goes through Chinese approval process pretty darn quickly, and it's sold in China. So, it's a very regularized system for getting consumer goods into China. And I really shocked my friends from Brussels when I said, you know what, the Chinese system for approval of consumer products compares favorably to the EU system for approval. I'll get through faster in China than I will in the EU.
So just going back to a little bit of social platforms, things like that. I mean, seeing that, that's really driving sales in China now, maybe that we're seeing a little bit in the West, but it's much farther along, in China. I mean, one, an easy one that comes to mind is live streaming and how advanced, China is with live streaming. But we'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of, what aspects of social, and other ways, particularly in mobile, that are driving success in China, currently.
Yeah, this is interesting, Max, and we're still learning, but I'll say this, some brands and some products have social currency and some do not. But by social currency, I mean, if you bought this product or if you received it as a gift, would you tell anybody about it? Now, depending on your age and so forth, you might say, look, I generally don't post on social media if I just got a new gift. But some people, particularly younger people, do post that they got a new sweater or their boyfriend got them something or God knows what. And some brands and some product have that social currency, but this becomes very powerful because you have a natural force multiplier in the general population where people want to talk about your product. So one step we take when we try to evaluate a brand's potential in the market is we try to evaluate, are people currently discussing this product and what are they saying about it? So you can do a sort of social census for it. Some brands are very sophisticated in how they present themselves digitally. And I would say in the US, we see this dramatically with the makeup and beauty products, that their life is digital, right? They communicate with their customer base digitally and show things. Live stream is an important element of that, Max, because live stream lets you do two or three things. First of all, live stream can be a very useful attribute for celebrity endorsement, frequently called key opinion leader or KOL endorsement. So you can have a movie star or a model talk to you. And because it's live stream, it has much greater authenticity, right? It's not just a film spot of somebody chatting to a camera in a studio, but this person is taking questions in real time, responding in real time, demonstrate, she can rub it on her arm and put water on it and show you how it stays tough even in rain. And so there's things a celebrity can do that really give that product authenticity. The other thing we've done, for example, is talk about production process. So for example, we sell Abbott baby formula, Similac, in China, and we took them into the laboratory in Columbus, Ohio. We did a live stream from Columbus with a scientist from the lab talking about quality control, statistical process control, showing them the production process. So it's a validator. It helps the consumer feel better about the product. If safety and hygiene and quality control are important elements, you say, boy, live stream really brings that home.
Great. And if someone, with the importance of social media in China, what kind of factors does that become for brands coming from the West, in the sense of, as you were saying, some brands are, sort of already have that built into their DNA, others, a little bit less so in the US, as it's not quite as critical a factor. Is it, how important is that as people are thinking about going to China? Or
yeah, here's an important point, Max. Why do insurgent brands or new brands sometimes outperform incumbent brands or legacy brands? Well, they can be hungrier, they can be scrappier, the market can segment sometimes, and the legacy brand doesn't always know that because they've been so dominant for so long that somebody just grabs a piece of it. But we see this phenomenon increasingly, and I think digital is part of it because digital greatly reduces the cost of that communication, and it rewards the insurgent brand. So it rewards the Dollar Shave Club, who comes up with a bit of a saucy ad and a saucy brand position. And in a sense, Gillette and Schick are the dominant incumbents, it sort of leaves them as staid incumbents. So I'd ask the brand, how do you guys fit into this? Do you have a message? If you're a new to market brand, you have to behave in a way that allows the consumer to fall in love with you. You have to be able to tell your story in a way that maybe in your home market you don't need to tell. In your home market, everybody grew up with you, their parents used you, their friends use you, you're ubiquitous. So you don't have to discuss if you're Smucker's jelly or if you're Crest toothpaste, you don't have to discuss the importance of jelly or toothpaste. But if you're going to China, you've got to have a conversation that allows that consumer to fall in love with you. And the consumer, I think, globally is increasingly demanding, meaning a generation or two ago, corporate communication was one way. The company or the brand told the consumer, here's what we do, and please go buy us. Nowadays, it's much more two-way. It's a conversation. The consumer has questions. The consumer has opinions. You as the company, you're taking place in this conversation. You're adding to it, we hope, but the consumers have their opinion as well. So you have to be able to go into this environment, I think, with a degree of agility that you might not need in your home market, right? So there's got to be a degree of creativity and cleverness and conversational and digital strength that will allow you to have some kind of traction with the Chinese consumer.
So to change gears just a little bit in response to a question here, where this is, we haven't actually talked about supply chain, and obviously there's a lot going on in terms of, certainly in the U.S. With supply chain issues. The question is, how much has that impacted, what's going on in China, and I guess by extension, then, how much would a Western, company be dealing with, are they dealing with similar supply chain issues in their Chinese business, or is it, or are they having a different experience over there?
Well, look, every company's different. Some people are facing acute problems because of supply chain, and other companies say, no, we're sort of barreling through it. It's not really that disruptive. So every company has got a different story. I'll say this is independent of the current challenges, but independent of that, a pattern we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years is the disaggregation between supply chain and demand, meaning in part because of e-commerce or accelerated because of e-commerce, you can sell any place in the world. Separately, you can source from any place in the world, and you can assemble any place in the world. And your ability to manage all of this has improved dramatically because of digital economy. So if you go back more than 20 years, only the global majors could do this. Only the Procter & Gamble's and the Nikes and so forth could say we have this global apparatus of supply and sourcing and assembly and sales, and it's this global machine. But nowadays, you've got mid-tier companies that say, look, I'm sourcing from 4 different countries, and I'm selling in 20 different countries. And I'm not a huge company, and I don't have offices in all those places I source from or sell into, right? But I use outsources for supply and demand. So the point is, you now can disaggregate this, and you can, aim for efficiencies. The one evolution we've seen in the last few years, I think because of COVID and COVID-related shocks, is be careful of concentration risk. Be careful of simply organizing your entire supply chain around whatever country might be supposedly the best supplier of a product or component, because then you might have concentration risk. And if there's a disruption in that one particular market, your entire production chain can suffer. So it behooves, I think, all firms that are sourcing from different countries to have multiple sources, have a little bit of an insurance policy baked into that supply chain.
Has there been any benefit to, companies that have been sourcing in China and then had a strong Chinese business, right, in terms of less disruption in their overall supply chain?
Sure. I mean, famously, companies like Nike and Apple and Levi's do that. And I guess you would say to the extent you can shorten that supply chain and keep it all on a domestic footing, you're going to be better off. But I would also say, I'd go back to the previous point to say, look, these really should be 2 different business exercises. If you're telling me I'm in charge of marketing for a company, I'm going to try to examine the markets of the world and say, what is the most promising market for me, and how do I allocate resources against return in those markets? That's a marketing business development set of questions. If you're telling me I'm on the production side, I'm going to ask the same set of questions from a production point of view. Where should this product properly be made or assembled or modified? for the best kind of results, right? And those are really largely unrelated questions, and one normally wouldn't drive the others, especially in consumer goods. I could see in some areas like more advanced chemical processing or very capital intensive activities where you say, well, they've got to kind of, one's got to kind of drive the other. But with consumer goods, they're largely unrelated questions, I would say.
Great. Well, Frank, thank you so much. I think we covered a lot of ground here, and let me hand it back over to Ken to wrap us up.
Max, thank you. Thanks so much for your questions and the conversation.
Really terrific conversation, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Frank, we hold a lot of policy conversations on the WITA stage, whether it's our electronic stage or in person. We frequently don't have enough of these conversations about the practicalities of doing business in these markets. And obviously that's the other side of the coin of the policy debates and discussions that we're having. So super helpful for the WITA membership and audience to hear from you. I think your book, it's a terrific addition to the literature. I know a lot of folks. Yeah, hold it up for us. We linked to it in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you for the link. Thanks for the plug, Ken. Appreciate it.
So really grateful to you, Max. Really nice to work with you on this one. Hope to have you both back on the WITA webinar or a live stage platform in the future. Thanks to all of you for watching today. Look forward to hosting you at some of our future upcoming events. They were all linked in the chat, and you can find them on our website, www.wita.org. Thanks, everybody. Please take care of yourself and take care of everyone around you.
Thanks. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Max. Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed it today.